Have you ever felt like you weren't really alone in your own home? Not the kind of feeling you get when you watch a scary movie, but that deeper, heavier feeling, the one that creeps into your chest when the house is quiet and you swear you hear something moving above you. Most of us shrug it off. Old houses creak, pipes shift, the wind pushes against the walls. We tell ourselves these things to feel safe, but what if it wasn't the house at all? What if there really was someone up there? This is the story of the Watcher in the Attic, a story that will make you think twice before you close your eyes tonight. The house where this story begins wasn't extraordinary at first glance. It stood in a quiet neighborhood, a little worn from age, but nothing that would turn heads. The kind of place people drive by without a second thought. The family who lived there had been renting it for a few months. They weren't superstitious. They weren't easily spooked. To them, it was just a house, 4 walls, a roof, a place to sleep at night. But there was one part of the house they almost never used: the attic. It was a cramped space, tucked away behind a narrow wooden door and a pull-down ladder. Like most attics, it was dusty, filled with old boxes and forgotten furniture. A place you visit once, then avoid unless you absolutely need to. From the first day, the attic felt different. Not in a dramatic haunted house way, more like a heaviness, an odd stillness that hung in the air. The family brushed it off as their imagination. After all, everyone knows attics are supposed to feel unsettling. They're dark, they're dusty, and they're almost always silent. But sometimes, silence isn't comforting. Sometimes, silence makes you notice the smallest sounds. And it wasn't long before the family started noticing things they couldn't quite explain. At first, it was nothing more than a sound. Late at night, when the rest of the house was quiet, there would be a faint creak overhead, almost like a footstep, but just one. Then silence. The family tried not to think much of it. Houses make noises, especially older ones. Wood shifts, pipes groan, the wind presses against the roof. Easy explanations. But the noises didn't stop. Some nights, it was a soft scratching. Other nights, it sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor above them. They joked about it at first. Maybe we've got raccoons up there. But deep down, none of them really believed that. The attic had no easy way for animals to get in. And besides, the sounds seemed too deliberate, too controlled. Then came the smaller things. A glass on the kitchen counter that wasn't where they remembered leaving it. A door that they swore they had locked, now standing open. Food missing from the pantry, just small amounts at a time. Each time they told themselves there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone forgot. Maybe they misplaced it. Maybe they were just tired. But little by little, those doubts began to pile up. And with every passing night, the sense of unease grew stronger. By now, the family couldn't ignore it anymore. The noises weren't rare, one-off events. They were happening almost every night. Always after dark, always when the house was still. One evening, while lying in bed, the father froze as he heard it again. Slow, steady footsteps crossing the attic floor. Not scurrying, not scratching. Footsteps, heavy enough to rattle the beams. He sat up, holding his breath, waiting for them to stop. And when they did, the silence felt worse. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, the kind that makes you realize something had been listening back. The next morning, he told himself it was nothing. Maybe he was half asleep. Maybe his mind had exaggerated the sound. But when he checked the attic ladder, he noticed something odd. The rope pull was swaying slightly, as if it had just been used. His heart sank. Meanwhile, the mother had her own experiences. She'd wake up to faint whispers, not loud enough to understand, but just enough to know someone was speaking. She tried to blame it on neighbors, or maybe a TV left on in another room. But deep down, she knew the truth. Every family member had their own story, but none of them wanted to admit it out loud, because saying it would make it real, and the longer they stayed silent, the stronger the fear became. It wasn't just sounds anymore. There were signs, small, almost invisible, that someone had been moving through their home. One morning, the daughter went to grab her backpack from the hallway closet. Buried behind the coats, she noticed something strange. A small candy wrapper that wasn't hers, tucked into the corner. At first, she thought nothing of it. But when she showed her parents, neither of them recognized it either. Another time, the mother climbed a chair to change a light bulb in the hallway. As she reached up, her eyes wandered toward the ceiling vent, her stomach turned cold. But the father experienced perhaps the most unsettling clue. He worked late nights, often coming home after everyone was asleep. One night he walked in and swore he heard someone moving just above him. When he glanced toward the attic door, he noticed it wasn't flush against the ceiling like usual. It was slightly ajar, only an inch, but enough for the faintest draft to seep through. That was the moment his unease turned into suspicion. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. But suspicion doesn't always lead to action. Sometimes, fear convinces you it's better not to know the truth. From this point on, the family started having moments that went beyond suspicion, moments where they nearly came face to face with whatever was in the attic. One night, the daughter was doing homework in her room when she heard soft thumps above her ceiling. She looked up, frozen, as the sound traveled from one side of the attic to the other. The light bulb above her flickered once, then steadied. She stared at it, holding her breath, convinced that if she moved even an inch, something would look back down at her through the ceiling. Another time, the mother woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. As she stepped into the hallway, she swore she saw movement at the end of it, a shadow pulling back into the attic door. Her heart pounded in her ears as she slowly approached, but when she looked up, the rope ladder was tucked away neatly. The door sealed tight, too tight, as though nothing had ever moved. But the closest call belonged to the father. He came home late again, unlocking the front door as quietly as possible so he wouldn't wake the others. But as he stepped inside, he froze. A faint glow seeped through the thin cracks of the attic hatch. Someone had a light on up there. His throat went dry. Slowly, he reached for the nearest object he could use as a weapon, a heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter. But just as he steadied himself, the glow vanished. A soft click echoed above him, followed by silence. When he finally climbed into bed that night, he didn't tell his wife what he saw. He couldn't. How do you explain to someone that there may be a stranger living above your head? The breaking point came on a rainy evening. The family had gathered in the living room, trying to ignore the unease that had settled into their daily lives. But then, there was a sound unlike any they'd heard before. Not footsteps, not scratching. A loud, deliberate thud, followed by the unmistakable drag of something heavy across the attic floor. The father stood, pale, his fists clenched. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He grabbed the same heavy flashlight he'd held that night and made his way to the attic door. His wife begged him to wait, to call someone, but he shook his head. He had to know. With shaking hands, he pulled the rope and lowered the creaky wooden ladder. A rush of stale air drifted down, thick with dust. He climbed slowly, every step groaning under his weight, until his head rose into the dark. The beam of his flashlight cut through the blackness, and that's when he saw it. In the corner of the attic, behind stacks of forgotten boxes, was a nest. A pile of blankets, food wrappers, and personal belongings scattered in a way that left no doubt. Someone had been living there. And tucked among the clutter was something even worse. A notebook. Its pages filled with messy handwriting. On the open page, written over and over, were the words, "I'm watching." As the father crouched there in the attic, staring at the pile of belongings, a wave of dread washed over him. The room felt colder, heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on him, and then, behind him, something shifted. He spun around, the flashlight beam shaking wildly across the rafters. For a split second, it landed on a figure. A pale face, wide eyes reflecting the light, crouched low in the shadows. The father's breath caught in his throat. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Who's there?" The figure didn't answer. It only blinked slowly, like a predator deciding whether to strike. For what felt like hours, they stared at each other, the father gripping his flashlight like a weapon, the watcher hunched and still, just feet away. Then, in one sudden movement, the figure scrambled backward, slipping into the darkest corner of the attic, disappearing into a narrow gap between the beams. The sound of scurrying filled the space, then silence. By the time the father gathered the courage to shine his light again, the attic was empty. He stumbled back down the ladder, slamming the hatch shut behind him. His wife and daughter looked at him in terror, demanding answers, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. Because how do you explain what it feels like to lock eyes with someone who has been watching you for months? The family didn't sleep that night. How could they? Every creak, every gust of wind agay, demanding answers. But he couldn't bring himself to speak. Because how do you explain what it feels like to lock eyes with someone who has been watching you for months? The family didn't sleep that night. How could they? Every creak, every gust of wind against the roof made them flinch. The attic hatch loomed above them like a trap door to hell, and they all knew. The next morning, the father called the police. Officers searched the attic top to bottom. They found the blankets, the wrappers, even the notebook filled with that chilling phrase, "I'm watching." But of the watcher himself? Nothing. No footprints outside, no broken locks, no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The police told them it was probably a squatter, someone who found a way in through an old vent or crawl space. They assured the family he was gone now. But the explanation didn't ease their fears, because the family knew what they saw. That pale face, those unblinking eyes. And in the weeks that followed, when the nights grew too quiet, they still sometimes heard it. A faint creak above their heads, a soft thud in the silence, as if he never really left. The family eventually moved out of the house. They packed their belongings, locked the doors one last time, and never looked back. But leaving didn't erase the memory. It didn't erase the feeling that, somewhere in the dark, eyes were still watching. And maybe that's the most terrifying part. You can change homes, you can change cities, but once you've lived with the thought that someone has been silently observing you, you never really feel safe again. So tonight, when your house grows quiet, when the hum of the day finally fades into silence, take a moment to listen. Listen carefully, because that creak in the ceiling, that faint rustle in the shadows, what if it isn't your imagination? What if someone is watching you right now? If this story gave you chills, make sure to subscribe for more haunting tales. And remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts at all. Sometimes they're the ones who live just out of sight. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye for now.